Who is Steve Vizard?
Steve Vizard is a grandparent, a granddad. He's a slave. He's a dishwasher. He's a car driver. He's a napier disposer of. He is a person who makes the worst possible second-hand purchases on Grays online, but hopefully a good friend. That would be the best thing that I could be measured by, being a loyal friend.
We're delighted to announce our newest partner for Legends of Bevo. A big welcome to Ancora National. Ancora National are an incredible organisation with passionate staff that are all about giving people living with a disability a better life by helping them to find employment. They believe that everyone is deserving of living a fulfilling life with no one left behind, and they provide a range of support services to people living with a disability. To find out more, go to their website, ancoranational.com.au. Well, he's an award-winning writer, producer, lawyer, and of course a television broadcaster. He's a 1991 Gold Logie winner, 2001 Father of the Year as well. There's not much he hasn't done. Steve Vizard, welcome to Comedy Legends of Bevo for the first time.
G'day, Bevo. How are you? Great to be here, mate.
So good to have you on the show. I want to go back in the days when you were studying, you were a young man, and you got into a scholarship to study art, philosophy, and also law at the Melbourne University. Tell us about that and what you learned from studying philosophy as well, and then perhaps how that's gone forward to your television career.
Well, two problems with it. One, it was so long ago I can barely remember it. And two, I can't recall that I actually turned up to that many lectures. I came from living sort of in semi-rural outside of Melbourne on a place that was too far to commute to the uni every day. And I'd gone to an all-boys school. So I got into uni. I didn't know anything about it. These were the days when you didn't go to uni to do a course. You went to uni to work out what you wanted to be. And you had 4 or 5 years of luxury to work it out. So we arrived at Melbourne Uni, and a couple of other blokes I'd known from school were there. We went into a college, a residential college. It was called Whitley College. I had a scholarship to go there. And it was like, suddenly my life exploded. Firstly, I wasn't living at home anymore. Secondly, I could sleep into whatever. I mean, it was pathetic. Thirdly, I literally would go down a flight of stairs and they would feed you food, and then I'd just go back up to my room again. So all your things were taken care of. But mainly, for the first time in my life, there was actually girls. I'd barely sighted a girl. I lived so far away from the school, it was a 2-hour trip by bus to get home from school every night. So I literally spent my life on a bus carrying this really heavy school bag. So suddenly to be in the middle of Melbourne, at Melbourne Uni, with people mucking around, going to parties, drinking. So when you say, how was philosophy? My philosophy for the first year was live. And I just had the best time. I remember, and this is how I got into doing comedy. They had these thing called Archie Reviews or Architecture Review, which was just a sketch show that all the architect students did. I was studying law and philosophy, allegedly. And so I saw this in the Farrago, which was the student paper. There was an ad, if you want to be in this review. So I went along. I'd written a few sketches with a mate of mine, Roger Wallace, who was a mathematician, off his head, the same as me. And we'd written some sketches, and they said, well, can you read them out? So we read them out, and everyone laughed. And we said, well, who's going to do them? And they said, well, you guys are doing them. And I said, no, we don't want to do them. They said, no, you do them best, so you do them. So they had this show, and it only went for a week. And it was my first taste of doing comedy, because I got up on the stage, we did our sketches, and people laughed, and it went gangbusters. And in the audience, in those days, they had theatre restaurants in Melbourne. This is an age before there's any online stuff. And so there was these little cafes and shops and whatever that had been converted into theatre restaurants, and they'd serve a meal. It was a shithouse meal.
Oh, is that like witches and bitches and that sort of thing?
I think we call it witches. It was witches and britches, to be fair. Bevo. Yeah. They had, there was one called Foibles. There was one called The Last Laugh. There was one called The Flying Trapeze. And they became quite famous. And they'd only hold 40 people or so. And there were people who'd driven in from the suburbs, and mainly the acts were people who were living in the suburbs, uni students, people like that. And they'd put on a little show, and it might have cost $30, and you've got a really bad meal with, chocolate ripple cake for dessert and stuff like that. But it was this encounter, and it was in this tight little room. Well, a couple of the owners of those venues were there at the Archie Review, and they said, "Oh, here's some blokes who get paid nothing to put on a show." So they asked us to do a professional show. And it was our first taste of doing theatre. And we loved it. We couldn't believe we were getting paid, and they paid us nothing. I mean, it was probably $30 a show. But we couldn't believe we were getting paid basically for mucking around on the stage. And so that was my introduction to theatre. So when you say, as I said, how was philosophy? I literally spent no time in any lecture theatres for the first year because we were doing these comedy shows.
And Fast Forward and Full Frontal, absolutely loved it back in the day. I'm in my mid-40s now, so I was sort of from that 90s era, and so glad I grew up in that era with comedy companies, the Full Frontals, the Fast Forward, these sort of shows. They were just so good. And how did the Full Frontal Fast Forward journey begin though for you, Stephen? We were blown away by the success of them.
Yeah, it was funny. I went from uni and I actually got a job as a lawyer. Hard to believe. And I was working as an international lawyer overseas. Like, it was a high-powered job. I can't believe they paid me to do it. So, I was flying from Melbourne to Germany and Switzerland and the UK and all these, Japan, doing negotiations for these big things. I had no idea what I was doing, I should say. And I'd written a few sketches for various shows, one called The 11th Hour that we'd done 5 or 6 years before. And I was overseas working as a lawyer. One of my very good friends, Ian McFadgen, and Mary Ann Frey and Mark Mitchell got up the comedy company. And I was working in Germany and Britain at the time. But the comedy company was essentially the same people we'd done shows with, and Channel 10 bought it, but I wasn't in it. I was still working as a lawyer. And it went from being nothing to being put up against 60 Minutes and becoming the blockbuster TV success of that year. Channel 7 were obviously pissed off they didn't have such a show. So they, the bloke, the programmer called Gary Fenton, rang me. I was in Switzerland at the time and said, "Listen, you're a comedy writer, we know. Would you be interested in doing a show that we want to compete against the comedy company success?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure." And there's a funny story about that. The bloke I was working with, I was working on these big deals and I didn't want to let him down. And I said, "Mate, I've been offered to do a TV show." And he couldn't believe I was, because he only knew me as a lawyer, and he couldn't believe I was going to be doing a TV show. And we were having dinner at this ritzy hotel on the edge of a lake in Zurich. And he did this great thing. And I said, I don't want to let you down because, we've been doing so much work together. And he put his finger into the glass of water on the table and he took it back out again. And he said, "See the hole that left? That is the hole you will leave in our business." And I thought, "Oh, you bastard." But actually, what he was saying was, things go on, systems go on, organizations keep going on. So and then he said, the greatest thing, he said, "Do it, enjoy it. If it works, and if it doesn't, the job's still here." But he said, "Don't die wondering." And it was the best advice. So I told I got on the phone and discussed it with my then fiance, who was later my wife, Sarah. And she said, "We just got married. We just bought a house. I was a lawyer. We had a mortgage." And she said, "Well, just do it," which was the most bizarre decision because I left this big job to go and do, I think they contracted 8 episodes, literally 8 episodes. And if it had failed, I probably could have gone back, but it was, 8 episodes. What do you do in 8 episodes? So I remember thinking at the end of that year, after I'd quit and I was about to start the next year, I was thought to myself, as I walked into this little tin shed they'd given me at Channel 7, I had no employees, no cast, no nothing. It was just me at the start. I thought to myself, what the hell have I done? And I started ringing around. I rang all these people that I'd known from uni, Peter Moon, people I'd seen on other shows who were my contemporaries, Michael Veitch, Mark Downey, Magda Zabansky, Jane Turner, Gina Riley, Ernie Dingo, people that I had worked with or known, and they all said, yeah, I'm in. So I got my cast together, and the big idea I had was the Comedy Company was a sketch show, but it dealt with life in Middle Australia. So my big idea was there were only 5 TV stations, networks in the day, and everyone watched them, 9, 10, 7, and the ABC. And so my big idea was, let's do a show about watching telly, about what's on telly. And we could do parodies of the shows, we could do news, we could get commentators, Jan Event, Darren Hinch and all of them, and talk about what people are watching in their living rooms. So the sketch show Fast Forward was basically a fast forward of a week's viewing of what's been on telly. That was the idea. And it went from being this sort of show that we had no idea what we were doing to within 6 or 7 weeks later being the number one show on telly. And by the network flew down. And even though we had only done 8 episodes, they signed up another 4 series, taking it through another 4 years off the strength of the first couple of episodes. So it was a big deal. So suddenly the stupid decision I'd made seemed kind of not a bad one.
I wanted to ask you as well about the characters that you used to play, like, Darren Hinch, George Zanicki, and the list goes on, and Don Lane as well. What was their reactions as well to you playing them?
I remember I did a John Laws, who was a big broadcaster at the time. He had the golden tonsils, and he was the biggest thing in radio in Sydney at the time. And he did a Valvoline commercial, and we took the piss out of him several times. And I remember I was in my little office, this crappy little office in this tin shed after the first 6 or 7 episodes. And one of the people in the shed said, there's a phone call for you, Steve. So I picked it up, and there was this voice that I instantly recognised. Hello, is that Steve? And I thought, oh, and it was John Laws. He'd rung up from Sydney, and I thought he's going to sue me. And he rang up. He went out of his way to ring up and say, I'm loving the show, keep it up, which was so generous. Same with Hinch. Hinch, we mercilessly bagged Hinch, terribly bagged Hinch. The character, because I'd listened to him on radio in Melbourne, and all he did was whinge. He whinged about everything. I don't like people with red hair. I don't like people with blue eyes. I don't like people who drive yellow cars. The most inane stuff. He was whinging the whole time. So basically, we just did that character left, right, and centre. Well, I ran into him, and he said, "Oh, at first he was a bit sort of." I thought, "Oh shit, he's going to hit me," but he actually was quite congratulatory. I'll tell you a funny story. He ended up doing a show while we were making Fast Forward, and it was called Hinch, and it was a nightly current affairs show. And I hadn't seen him that much since we got worse and worse in bagging him. Anyhow, I was getting made up one day in makeup in Channel 7. I got my beard put on, and I just finished. I looked like him. And he came in and sat next to me to get made up to go and do his show. And I was off to go and do a shoot at TV Week as Hinch, dressed up as Hinch. So my character was called Hunch. They've got a car for me, so I'm waiting outside on the footpath, and I'm dressed as Hinch, the whole box and dice, and the real Darren Hinch races past me and jumps into a car that's waiting for him, and takes off. And he said, "You're Gabe Vizard." He said, "I've got 7 people trying to assassinate me at the moment." And I'm standing on the footpath waving. Literally, I was a target. I was like a human shield for him. But we ended up getting on quite well. I mean, the things we did, I went on and did a Tonight Show, and I did shocking things to him. Like, he had a dressing room down the corridor, and one night, there was, because we were desperate to do things on air, I said, "Is anyone in the audience a bricklayer?" And there was a bricklayer in the audience. And I'd got some bricks organised, and I got the brickie to brick up his dressing room door during the show. And then we found a plasterer, we plastered it and painted over it so that there was no record of where his door had ever been. So he came in the next day. We did terrible things to him. I mean, he had this huge billboard called Everybody Loves Hinch. And I don't know what possessed us, but it was on the freeway. It was this massive super sign with his smiling face with a beard. And I think I got an Academy Award winner called Cliff Robertson, who'd won an Academy Award, who was a guest on the show, who said that he was quite good at drawing. And we drove him out live on air. It was just a brainwave. We got a crane, one of those, and we painted his head into a pumpkin on this giant super sign. The network went ballistic the next day. He went ballistic. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, there's stupid things, but they were, I don't know, he kind of asked for it, really.
And how long does it take you to actually get into the character like Hinch? Like, how much research do you have to do in preparation?
Oh, look, the research was pathetic. The research was watching telly. So, you watch telly and you'd see someone. I mean, we would do every week on Fast Forward and Fast Forward and then Full Frontal, with Eric Banner and Sean McAuliffe and those people. Those two shows were weekly shows. That's an hour a week of sketches, basically ran for 10 years. So it's a long time. So every week we would do a different, amongst all of the regular characters, we'd do a parody of a well-known show. It could be Lost in Space, or it could be the Flintstones or something else. And we'd strip that show throughout that episode. And so every week you had to be someone different. You had to be, Dr. Smith from Lost in Space, or you had to be, the camp commandant from Hogan's Heroes, or you had to be the chief from Get Smart, or whatever it was, or a movie. So we would do them week after week. So everyone in the cast, which was a spectacularly good cast, became really adept at, getting into characters really quickly, because there's no time in a weekly show to get the character and work out their psyche and how would they react. Like, literally everything's on the run.
And the Tonight Live show, obviously you've interviewed some amazing people, like over thousands and thousands in the end, and people like Robin Williams, the list goes on. But who are some of your favourites and why?
You're right. I mean, we interview people like, I love music, so we interviewed George Benson and Peter Allen. Peter Allen was the first guest I ever had. We had, who else do we have? Chevy Chase, Harry Connick Jr., Alice Cooper, Kirk Douglas, Michael Douglas, Mel Gibson, excellent talent. One of my favourites was Bob Hope. He was one of the greatest names in American entertainment and comedy, and he'd done movies with these people like Bing Crosby, and he'd hosted the Oscars, and he was one of the giants of American entertainment and comedy. So I got to interview Bob, and no one told me he was deaf. He's an old man. And so I studied up, I read his books, I was all ready to go, and I said, Bob, I said, what was it like working with Bing Crosby? That must have been a thrill. And he said, they sure can hop, those kangaroos. What are you talking about? So then I went with him and said, yeah, no, they're amazing kangaroos. And he said, yeah, I normally play 2 or 3 times a week. Jeez, we had the most disjointed conversation. I'd ask him a question and he'd answer a different question. It was unbelievable. It was kind of funny, but in the worst possible way.
We'll take a quick break, Steve, because I want to ask you next about your 1991 Gold Logie and also being named the Father of the Year in 2001. And also if you've got some advice for budding television presenters like myself as well. But we'll take a quick break and we'll be back very soon with Steve Vizard. Huge thanks to Aussie Rules Global for being an amazing sponsor the last few years. And speaking of Aussie Rules Global, if you want to be part of something special next year on Anzac Day over there in Gallipoli and you're over the age of 18 and you're a male or female, check this out.
The Slugs plan to play men's and women's games here at this soccer ground, the closest to the Gallipoli battlefields during the 2025 commemorations. The idea to make it spectacular, to fill this entire area with Aussie Anzac pilgrims. Vincent Malia tours with the Southern Slugs. Footy, he says, is perfect to honour the Diggers.
They would love it, I'm sure, because it's bringing Australia over there, isn't it?
I want to ask you about your 1991 Gold Logie, because you were nominated 4 times as well. What did that mean to you to win that? Because it's such a prestigious award, and we've seen so many legends being nominated over the years that haven't actually gone on to win it, like your Limmer Grangers and people like that. There's so many out there that haven't been lucky as yourself.
It was a genuine surprise. It was a great honour. And I sort of remember the actual night particularly because my wife was there. We'd already had, and this is how things changed. When I went into TV the year before, I literally just got married when I started Fast Forward. By the time that year ended, we'd had our first child. By the time the next year, which I'd had my first year of my Tonight Show ended, and I was sitting there at the Logies, Sarah was 9 months pregnant at the Logies, and they announced that I'd won, and then we went off to the hospital. And so what I actually remember was a great night. John Farnham presented me with my Logie. I think Daryl Summers was hosting, I can't recall. But I remember a great night. And then I remember literally our son was born. That's the part that I remember. And it was a great time. And it was nice to be recognised. But to be honest, the great thrill was making the shows with like-minded people. That was the great thrill of it.
And 2001, Father of the Year. What did that mean to you? And what word of advice do you have for other fathers out there? Because I'm a father myself. I've got a 2-year-old, but old as dad, now in my 40s.
I give no advice to anyone about parenthood. You know, the most, other than it's the greatest gift, it's the greatest gift of all is to have little people and to see them just look up at you and absorb things and, you know, and cherish every day because they do grow up so quickly. And Bevo, if you think for a second that the hard work is now and there will be a time when they leave you and it gets back to being peaceful, mate, you are gravely mistaken. It gets worse and worse and worse. You know, then there's teenage years and then there's getting ready for their exams and all of that or whatever they want to do. And then they move out, and then you've got to go and move furniture, and then they hit you up, and then they have a bust up with their partner, and then they're home again, and then their car gets, mate, their insurance, mate, you are in for the worst journey. So I offer you no advice, but you have my sincere sympathy for the whole journey. No, I cherish every second of it because you know it all goes too quickly. Yeah. The one thing I would say, this is a weird thing, other people might disagree, but I always saw my role as being the dad, you know, and my wife's the mum, and as being his parents. And some people like to be sort of friends with their, you know, best buddies, but I never saw my role as being a best buddy. I think, you know, that's not to say you're not friendly or friends, but it's a very specific form of friendship. It's being their parent, and that is the greatest role you can have.
You've got an event that's happening in Adelaide. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but you've actually got a book out as well, Steve, and you've written another book which is called Here Comes Grandpa. So just tell us about those two books and where people can buy them.
Well, Here Comes Grandpa is written for my grandkids because I've got grandkids, and it's a little sort of illustrated kids book, and it's based on the fact I was walking with my 5-year-old granddaughter, Poppy, and around our farm, and it was a hot day. And she said, Baba, because she calls me Baba, like an elephant, which is a bit insulting, but there you go. She said, Baba, why do you make strange sounds all the time? And I said, what do you mean? She said, and then she did this imitation on me. She goes, and I said, oh, give it a rest, Poppy. And then I worked out I actually make strange sounds as a grandpa all the time. So the book is called Here Comes Grandpa, and it's based on all of she could tell I was coming because of all the sounds I'd make before I got there. So it's a poem. It's Grandpa makes strange sounds when he walks. His knee clicks, and his back squeaks and squawks. He grunts and it's all the sounds that Grandpa makes when he walks, then Grandpa makes when he sleeps and when he eats. And so it's a kid's book, and it's beautifully illustrated. And you can get it at just go to online. You can buy it online at any of those sort of. It's called Here Comes Grandpa by me, Vizard, and it's a funny, beautiful kids book, and the kids love it. And the other book,
Nature, Memory, Myth, isn't it?
Yeah, it's called Nation, Memory, and Myth.
Yeah.
This is the most removed from Here Comes Grandpa you could have. This is a book about how nations have myths that hold them together. And Australia's great myth is Gallipoli. So this is a book explaining why Gallipoli has such a powerful hold over Australia. What is it about Gallipoli, and every nation's got their own versions of this, that makes a full crowd at the MCG? You know, people who've got cans of beers in their hand and they're holding up banners and their faces are painted and they're ready to go, and they've been screaming and they've got pasties and pies and sauce and they're ready to go. And yet on Anzac Day, when a bugle sounds, they'll stand up and for a minute's silence, they'll be in dead silence. And what is it about that myth that can make a nation stop like that, that can get people up at some ungodly hour to turn up in the dark to a flame that's burning, and strangers to stand shoulder to shoulder and celebrate something, to honour something? And so I explore what it is. And in a myth is basically the essence of a nation's values. It's a distilled template of what it is to be Australian. And it's a sacred, powerful thing. And so a myth is more than history. It's this little capsule of sacred nationalism, in our case, sacred Australia. And we call those values the Anzac spirit. And so I explain that in this book called Nation, Memory of Myth. And it's a powerful thing, but it's a really important thing to understand, because it's that force which binds us together as Australians.
Can't wait to have a read. That sounds absolutely unbelievable. And you're here actually in Adelaide next week, and I'm really looking forward to going on to that as well. It's going to be at the University of Adelaide. You're doing a talk with one of your friends. Tell us more about that and how we can get tickets for that, Steve.
Yeah, it's Stuart Ward, who's a kind of a famed historian, Professor Stuart Ward. It's on the 25th of March. It's at 5 p.m. I'll be signing the book, Nation, Memory of Myth. We've got drinks there. It's free, and I'm doing it because I'm a professor at the University of Adelaide. So it's at Adelaide Uni at 5 o'clock. And if you want to know where to get the tickets, just look up University of Adelaide Vizard, Vizard, and it'll have all the details there. But basically, next Tuesday, 5 p.m. at Adelaide Uni for free, and it's an hour long. It'll be a great, interesting chat. And there's free drinks and some grog and and a book signing afterwards. So I hope people, if they've got any interest in any of that stuff, are able to come along.
Will there be any impersonations of Hinch or anyone as well? Or
mate, if you want me to do one, I'll do one. Whatever you want, I'll do. If you come along and ask questions, I'll do some.
Amazing. I can't wait to meet you. Steve Vizard, what an absolute pleasure to have you on Comedy Legends with Bevo. I could talk with you all day, mate. Thanks so much for giving up your time.
Thanks, Bevo. Always a pleasure, mate.